Welcome back to the Piping Pastor Theology Talks. Today we'll be doing a subcategory discussion of positive masculinity. Well, I've kind of by accident stumbled on a topic here. Just going to start with, I'm smoking my current Meerschaum Church Warden today, and in it I'm smoking some Elizabethan mixture. So thought it might be nice to take a break from the Burleys and the Latakias and have a nice light vapor. But I've been speaking a bit about masculinity. I talked about toxic masculinity and a theological view of that. And then, of course, in our poem last time by Pablo Neruda, talked about him being tired of adhering to the constructs of masculinity based on the society in which he lived. So I thought it might be good to have a discussion of what biblical masculinity looks like. And as I was looking at that and researching it, I thought, this is kind of an important topic. A lot of people have engaged in this topic in the YTPC, done videos of what it means to be a man, what masculinity is, what it means to be a gentleman, what it means to be a gentleman pipe smoker. Some people have gone so far as to list rules of behavior, codes of conduct, and so on and so forth. Unsurprisingly, caused a bit of consternation. And I think, in truth, it takes a bit of hubris to come up with a code of conduct or a list of behaviors that a person should engage in and say, this is how things should be. Because we're a large and diverse community. And a lot of things need to be taken into account. And especially when you're talking about something like masculinity, manly behavior, gentlemanly behavior, and so forth, I think it's important to have a bit of context and a bit of understanding of history. So that's kind of where I'm going to be going with this series over the next couple of videos. So I'm not going to jump right into the biblical view. I thought it might be good to situate the conversation a bit better first. Now, my caveat on this, and please hear me, I am not saying this is the behavior that a man should adhere to. This is the true definition of masculinity. This is how a gentleman pipe smoker should behave, right? I'm not setting any rules out or anything else like that. What I'm simply going to be doing is offering some context and history and my interpretation of the biblical view to end with. And you can take with that whatever it is that you choose. But I think it's important to know where you stand, right? And to know why you're standing there. So if you come up with a list of manly behavior, where's that list come from? Okay? So we're going to go through a couple of phases here. In this first video, I'm going to be talking about chivalry and chivalrous behavior. Because in generally speaking, that's kind of where we begin with this idea of proper masculine behavior. It starts with the chivalrous behavior, then it moves into the Victorian understanding of gentlemanly behavior up until modern times, and then and then I say I'll do the biblical interpretation of it after that. But we'll start with chivalry. So what is chivalry? Where does that come from? Well, there are largely agreed upon 10 tenets of chivalrous behavior, 10 rules, 10 guidelines, however you want to refer to it. And these were first codified after some research by a French historian in the late 1800s. I have them written down here, so I don't go too far afield. But so the rules are: believe all that the church teaches and observe all of its directions. And of course, here we're talking about the Christian church. Defend the church, again, the Christian church. Defend the weak. Love and defend your country of birth. Do not retreat. Fight infidels without mercy. Perform your feudal duties if they're in line with God. So do what your king says as long as your king's in line with God. Never lie. Be generous to everyone. And everywhere and always fight for right against evil and injustice. Sound like some good rules to me, right? Except for maybe the fighting the infidels part. Because defining who an infidel is would be kind of difficult. After Luther, I'd be considered an infidel by the Catholics. But don't worry, Peter Piper and I still get along. But generally speaking, some good rules. The difficulty is we don't have any real historical evidence that these rules were ever applied. Whenever the chivalrous behavior is referred to, it's usually in poetic literature, it's in sagas, it's in stories. Le Morte d'Arthur is a good example, and the source material that Le Morte d'Arthur comes out of. It talks about knights and kings and how they should act, and that's where these kind of rules come from. Now, these rules were based on a militaristic society, a feudal society, so these rules applied to essentially the elites, the ruling class, because you were not a proper man at arms with a knight and with the armor and a sword and a horse, unless you had the money to pay for that. Right? You had a castle, you had serfs underneath you. You could provide men at arms to go fight in battles, and you yourself wore armor. Armor costs money. It also costs money to eat all the beef you need to be big enough to wear the armor, right? So peasants were not donning full suits of armor and jumping on a charger. So we have this set of rules applying to those in command, those in the ruling class, but they're referred to in days gone by. They're referred to in, back in the golden age, this is how things were. Back in the heyday of our country, back when things were great and there were men of honor abounding, this was the apex of society. This is how things should have been. We have a lot of discussions about that now today, and hearkening back to a time before when things were great and things used to be so wonderful, and but in hindsight, our memories may have a little bit of honey on them, and that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Because some of these codes, sure, were used later on in knighthood and so forth, defend the weak and fight for justice and so on and so forth. But when it comes to this idea of chivalrous behavior that the knights we do have historical records for adhere to, they adhere to them based on a memory of something that we don't have any historical record of. So these codes, this idea of chivalry comes from something we're not real sure ever existed. It may have just been people's idealistic vision of what those in power should be. Probably because those in power were not acting like this. Be generous to everyone. How many feudal lords do you think were walking around and seeing a poor peasant and giving them a cow or a handful of gold, right? No, I mean, they were rich and in power because they had money, because they held on to it, right? Or how many were fighting against injustice? Well, sure, on their own behalf, perhaps, but if, the duke above them or the king above them was acting in an unjust manner towards a rival of theirs, do you think they would stand up and say, no, take my land, not his? People back then acted much in the same way people do now. We're not different species. We haven't changed all that much. Selfish people exist now. Selfish people existed back then. So it's entirely possible, and indeed probable, that these rules and things like that were made up by these authors and these poets and these writers of the sagas to say, how great would it be if the people in charge acted like this? So those codes of chivalry, they're all based on militaristic stances of the people, the elites and the people in power, and they're based on something that we have really no record ever existed. We just have stories and poems. There is, interestingly, a link that has been somewhat established between the Saracen code of chivalry and the British or European code of chivalry, because there were Moorish knights just like there were Christian knights, and their code was dignity, eloquence, gentleness, horsemanship, artistic expression, physical strength, and weaponry. So an interesting mix of both courtly and martial behaviors. And this code is somewhat similar to what we see in the more specific area of chivalrous behavior that kind of came out of Europe. But again, we're talking about something idealistically prescribed. So when we talk about someone being chivalrous, we're talking about them adhering to a mythical norm that we're never sure really even existed. And this only applied to the wealthy and powerful and those who were in the top levels of the military. You wouldn't try to apply this to a peasant farmer. So to say that, the code of masculinity was this is not accurate. First of all, it's not based in real historical fact. And secondly, it only applied to a very small percentage of men at the time, not to everybody. So, hope I didn't burst any bubbles there. As always, if you have any questions about this, you want you follow up, by all means, put a comment in there and we'll ask. And then in the next video, we'll get into the Victorian version of chivalrous behavior, or as we move from chivalry to gentlemen's. So, well, with that, I'm going to go back to my vapor here. I hope you have a lovely week. Hope you have a great Christmas. If I don't see you, or of course I won't see you. If I don't get a video out before Christmas, I hope you have a great Christmas, if indeed you celebrate Christmas. And for everyone else, have a lovely week. And as always, happy reading.